It was small, laughably small, some sailors thought the first time they saw it. Just a slim barrel, a spindly mount, and a drum magazine that looked more like something from a factory assembly line than a weapon meant to defend a warship. Compared to the big 5-inch guns or the roaring 40mm Bofors, the Oerlikon 20mm seemed almost delicate. But the Pacific would prove that this little gun was the last shield between thousands of American sailors and a violent death from the sky. And before it earned that reputation, before it fired its first desperate burst in combat, it began its life in quiet workshops and test ranges, an unassuming weapon that no one realized would become a hero. A new kind of enemy in a new kind of war. In the early months of 1942, U.S. Navy intelligence reports described an enemy unlike anything American sailors had trained for. Japanese aircraft, Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo planes, attacked low, fast, and with terrifying precision. They didn't always give battleships or carriers the luxury of distance. They came in close, skimming waves, diving straight down or weaving through anti-aircraft fire with impossible agility. The Navy had big guns for big threats, but it needed something for the last 10 seconds. Something for the moment when a pilot was close enough to see the deck crew's faces. Enter the Oerlikon. The gun that looked too small to matter. Originally a Swiss design, the Oerlikon 20mm was compact, rugged, and brutally simple. Once the United States saw how desperately it needed a close-range defense weapon, factories across the country began producing them by the thousands. They arrived on ships in crates marked 20mm automatic gun, anti-aircraft. When sailors unboxed them, their reaction was almost the same. This little thing? But then they fired it. The first blast was a gut punch. The second rattled their teeth. By the third, most sailors staggered backward half-blinded by muzzle flash. The Oerlikon didn't fire like a gentle machine gun. It bucked, hard. It kicked and clawed at the mount like a wild animal fighting to get loose. Its fire rate, 450 to 500 rounds per minute, wasn't just fast. It was furious. A ripping, hammering roar that blended into one continuous, vibrating scream. And the tracers, bright neon white streaks, leapt from the barrel like fireflies possessed by demons. One sailor at Pearl Harbor described his first time firing it. It felt like holding a lightning bolt. Learning the hard way. On a carrier deck, a sailor assigned to an Oerlikon rarely had time to be glamorous. He stood exposed with nothing but a small steel shield if he was lucky, and a weapon that shook his bones every time it fired. Training was brutal. The gun had no power-assisted aiming. Everything was manual. Pure muscle, pure instinct, pure adrenaline. Gunners practiced tracking towed sleeves from aircraft flying overhead, their arms burning as they kept the gun aligned. Sweat ran into their eyes. Shell casings clattered onto the metal deck, some so hot they left burns through gloves. Older chiefs shouted constantly, "Don't stop firing until it's down. Follow your tracers. If you're thinking, you're too slow." Because combat in the Pacific would not give them time to think. The first test, Wake Island, Coral Sea, Midway. The Oerlikon's baptism of fire came suddenly. Wake Island witnessed some of the first desperate close-range defenses. Sailors barely trained on the gun used it to shoot down low-flying attackers weaving through the smoke of burning buildings. But it was at Coral Sea and then Midway where American sailors finally understood what the Oerlikon truly was. During the first waves of Japanese attacks, gunners saw something that chilled them. Enemy aircraft were getting through the outer defenses. The 5-inch guns barked and thundered, exploding flak high in the sky. The Bofors erected walls of steel at medium range. Yet some planes slipped past everything, too fast, too low, too committed to their attack runs. Those planes belonged to the Oerlikon. They were coming straight for the little gun. And that moment, the instant when a Japanese dive bomber rolled out of its dive and leveled out just above the waves, was where the Oerlikon proved exactly why it existed. Gunners gritted their teeth, pulled the trigger, and watched their tracers reach out like glowing fingers. The plane grew larger, too large. Its engine screamed. The wind from its passage slapped their faces. They fired until the barrel shook, until the drum ran dry, until their arms throbbed. Many didn't even remember pulling the trigger. One sailor at Pearl Harbor described it. When they came that close, we didn't aim. We didn't breathe. We didn't think. We just fired until the sky stopped shaking. The moment sailors understood. After Midway, Oerlikon crews across the Pacific realized something profound. This wasn't a little gun. This wasn't a backup weapon. And it wasn't secondary to the big batteries. It was the last defense, the final voice in a ship's plea to stay alive. Every carrier, every destroyer, every transport owed its survival not just to admirals and pilots, but to a line of young sailors gripping the handles of a small, furious weapon that demanded everything of them. And in the battles to come, Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, the Marianas, Leyte Gulf, the Oerlikon would earn its place not as a footnote, but as a savior. Part 1 ends on the quiet night after Midway. Sailors standing on darkened decks, leaning against warm barrels, eyes still wide with adrenaline. They didn't yet know that the real storm was still ahead, and that their little gun would face an enemy unlike any the world had ever seen. In May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Pacific Ocean turned from a battlefield into a proving ground. It was the first major naval engagement where carriers fought without ever seeing each other, only aircraft dueling over the horizon. But while admirals planned on charts and pilots fought in the sky, the sailors manning the Oerlikon guns discovered what close-range naval combat really meant. They learned that battles often narrowed down to the smallest possible arena, a few hundred yards, a few seconds of reaction, and the thin strip of steel where a gunner stood alone with a machine that kicked like a bull. And for many of those sailors, the moment the Oerlikon fired in anger for the first time would become a memory carved into muscle, bone, and nightmares. The first real attack, Coral Sea. On the morning of May 7th, the alarm clanged across the flight deck of USS Lexington. Every man who had ever trained on an Oerlikon sprinted to his position. What hit them first wasn't fear, it was wind. High winds swept across the deck from the carrier's turn into the attack, stinging their eyes as they strapped into the low steel shield behind their guns. Then came the sound every Pacific sailor would learn to dread, a distant, rising growl that wasn't thunder and wasn't the sea. Aircraft. Lots of them. Japanese dive bombers broke through the upper layers of flak and came screaming down toward the ships. The big 5-inch AA guns were too slow to track aircraft weaving down the last 1,000 yards. Even the 40mm Bofors struggled to pivot quickly enough. But the Oerlikon could. A gunner named Louis Red Harmon was on the starboard side, scanning the sky. He said, "We saw the first Val coming down like a hawk. I had maybe 3 seconds, maybe." He pulled the trigger. The Oerlikon roared, its tracers reaching up like a chain of burning beads. The Val's wings wobbled. Then it disintegrated into spray and fire. Red didn't even hear the explosion. His ears were already deafened by the gun's scream. He remembered only one thought: thank God I didn't hesitate. The Oerlikon's first kill and the aftermath. When the first Japanese bomber fell to a 20-millimeter gun, the sailors next to the mount erupted in disbelief. The Oerlikon wasn't supposed to kill planes outright. It was supposed to discourage them at best. But the close range made all the difference. 20-millimeter shells punched through aluminum skin, detonated inside the fuselage, shredded control cables, ruptured fuel tanks, blew pilot compartments apart. The bomber didn't just fall, it fell apart. And with that kill, something changed aboard the Lexington. The sailors no longer doubted the little gun. They trusted it. They believed in it. Their hands clamped the grips tighter. Their eyes followed their tracers with deadly focus. The Oerlikon crews became the final guardians of the ship. Midway, the battle that turned sailors into legends. 1 month later, at Midway, the Oerlikon faced its greatest trial yet. The Japanese attack waves that roared toward USS Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet were not careless or inexperienced. They were the elite, the same pilots who had shattered battleships at Pearl Harbor. They came fast, low, and without hesitation. And the Oerlikons met them head-on. On USS Yorktown, gunner James Calloway remembered the moment clearly. The sky was full of wings and fire. You didn't see planes, you saw shapes moving faster than your hands could turn the gun. Dive bombers dropped out of the sun. Torpedo planes skimmed the waves. Fighters strafed the deck crew. Smoke swallowed the horizon. Through this chaos, the Oerlikon gunners had a single job: shoot anything that looks like it's coming at us. That simplicity saved countless lives. 2 seconds to live. When a Japanese Kate torpedo bomber lined up at less than 800 yards, there was no time for complicated aiming. The torpedo track would strike the hull no matter what. The only question was whether the bomber dropped it before dying. Sailor Don Hughes described the instant vividly. A Kate was coming straight at us. I could see the prop turning. I could see the pilot's goggles. I pulled the trigger and kept it down. Didn't breathe, didn't blink, just fired. His tracers stitched across the bomber's fuselage, crawling up its spine. The plane caught fire. Its belly opened in flame. It never released the torpedo. It hit the water like a dead bird. Afterward, Hughes realized his hands were bleeding. He'd gripped the handle so hard that the metal ridges had cut into his palms. The ocean trembled with impact. Again and again, the Oerlikon spat fire. Again and again, planes fell, sometimes crashing into the sea, sometimes sliding across the deck in a skid of burning metal. No one kept count. No one stopped to celebrate a kill. The Pacific War didn't give time for moments like that. What sailors remembered most wasn't the kill, but the sensation. The deck shaking under their boots, the barrel glowing red, the drum magazine rattling with the final few rounds, the fear that the next bomber would be the one to reach them. A sailor on USS Enterprise said, "You don't aim an Oerlikon in a battle like Midway, you pray with it." On carrier decks, the Oerlikon was one gun among dozens, but on destroyers, escort vessels, oilers, ammunition ships, and transport carriers, the fragile backbone of the Pacific Fleet, it often stood alone. No thick armor, no layered walls of 5-inch guns, no Bofors every 20 feet, just a handful of 20-millimeter mounts and a crew whose lives depended on how long they could keep the trigger depressed. If the carriers were the fists of the U.S. Navy, these smaller ships were the arteries, and the Japanese knew that cutting arteries was sometimes more effective than breaking fists.
That meant these ships, these small men in a big ocean, needed something fierce, something fast, something that didn't care about elegance or doctrine. They needed the Oerlikon, and sometimes the Oerlikon was the only thing standing between them and the abyss. The exposed gunners of the outer circle. Destroyers and transports didn't have the layered AA shells of carriers. Their guns sat openly on deck, bolted to platforms barely above the waterline. A gunner could feel spray hitting his face. The wind tore at his uniform. Salt crusted on his goggles. On a calm day, firing the Oerlikon was already a battle against balance. The gun rocked back violently. The mount swayed. Each blast punched through the soles of your shoes. Now imagine firing it in a storm, or at full speed, or while your ship turned sharply to evade torpedoes. Many sailors said the first lesson of the 20mm was simple. If you fall off the ship, no one is stopping to get you. Nightmare over the slot. Destroyers under siege. In the Solomons, especially in the infamous slot, destroyers and transports became daily prey for Japanese Betty bombers and low-flying Zeros. These planes attacked at night, skimming the tops of waves, using clouds for cover. Radar helped, but not enough. 5-inch guns could fire illuminating shells, but not fast enough. Bofors mounts, if the ship even had them, were few. But the Oerlikon? It was always awake, always primed, always hungry. On USS Laffey, a young gunner named Charles Van remembered a low-level attack so sudden that he barely had time to swing his gun around before the bomber roared overhead. He fired by instinct, pure reflex. He squeezed the trigger until the barrel glowed white. The bomber passed so close that the wind from its wings nearly knocked him backward. When they checked the film from the bridge camera later, they realized something chilling. The plane missed the ship by less than 15 feet. Van's fire had severed half a wingtip, causing it to crash moments later. He never forgot the smell. Burning cordite, salt, and sweat mixed together in the freezing night air. The transport ships? Nowhere to run, nothing to hide behind. If destroyers had it hard, transports had it worse. They weren't fast. They weren't maneuverable. They often carried oil, ammo, or troops, floating prizes for enemy aircraft. These ships had maybe 4, 6, or 8 Oerlikons. No armor to protect the gunners. No big guns to deter attackers. They had raw courage and the 20mm. Nothing else. One account from the attack on the USS Liscum Bay describes an Oerlikon gunner firing at a torpedo bomber that came in so low the ship's wake splashed the underside of its fuselage. The gunner fired until the bolt locked open on an empty drum. Only then did he realize that his left arm had been cut by flying shrapnel and his uniform was soaked in blood. He survived. The bomber did not. The ship, tragically, was lost later to a torpedo, but dozens of men credited that Oerlikon battery for saving them from a direct impact that would have destroyed the ship far earlier. Face-to-face combat. Literally. In many attacks, Oerlikon gunners were close enough to see the whites of a pilot's eyes, close enough to see his scarf, close enough to see his teeth clenched in a scream. A gunner on a transport near Guadalcanal recalled watching a Zero make a strafing run directly at him. As the plane closed in, he could see the pilot's goggles reflecting the muzzle flash of his Oerlikon. He kept firing. The Zero kept coming. 30 yards, 20, 10. At the last moment, the wing snapped from his barrage and the plane cartwheeled into the water so close that the splash drenched him. He collapsed to his knees right there on the deck. Later he wrote, "I don't remember thinking anything. There was no aiming, just firing, just trying to stay alive." When the Oerlikon was the only thing working. Another terrifying truth about small ships. Everything else broke. Heavy guns jammed. Radars failed during storms. Machine guns froze or overheated. But the Oerlikon? Over and over, sailors repeated the same phrase. It never quit on us. Salt water soaked it. Spray froze on its receiver. Recoil springs rusted. The mount groaned in high winds, but the Oerlikon kept firing until there was no more targets, or no more ammo, or no more ship beneath it. The lone hero gun. There are dozens, almost too many to count, of single Oerlikon mounts saving entire ships. A lone gunner shooting down a torpedo bomber seconds before impact. A damaged destroyer limping home while two 20mm guns kept enemy float planes at bay. A hospital ship in the Solomons fending off strafing runs with just 4 Oerlikons and a crew of medics turned gunners. Every story had the same ending. The Oerlikon saved us. What sailors began to understand. By late 1943, the entire fleet, pilots, officers, deckhands, cooks, understood a truth that no one had expected. The Oerlikon was no longer merely a weapon. It was a survivor, a protector, the steel heartbeat of every small ship that dared cross the Pacific. But even the horrors of the Slot and the Solomons could not prepare the Oerlikon gunners for what was coming next. Because the next enemy wouldn't strafe, wouldn't release bombs, wouldn't retreat. The next enemy would come to die and take everyone with him. In the fires of the kamikaze era, the Oerlikon would face its ultimate trial. By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had changed. The skies no longer belonged to the rising sun. Their best pilots were gone, lost in the long, grinding battles from Coral Sea to the Marianas. Their aircraft production faltered. Their carriers lay on the ocean floor. But Japan still had one weapon left, one born not of strategy, but of desperation. A weapon that didn't retreat, didn't fear, didn't live. The kamikaze. When the first wave of suicide aircraft screamed out of the clouds over Leyte Gulf and Luzon, American sailors felt a new kind of terror, one no naval manual had ever prepared them for. This was not the old combat equation of hit the plane before it drops the bomb. This was a new nightmare. The plane itself was the bomb. And when that bomb came hurtling toward the deck at 300 knots, twisting through flak, cutting under 5-inch bursts, weaving past Beaufort's fire, the only gun still able to track, aim, and fire in the last seconds was the one sailors once called the little gun, the Oerlikon, the final voice before impact, the last heartbeat before death. The first kamikazes, shock, disbelief, and helpless seconds. When the first kamikazes struck at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, sailors didn't even understand what they were seeing. A Zero plummeting straight toward the deck normally meant the pilot was wounded or trying a last-ditch dive. But these planes didn't pull up. They didn't drop bombs. They didn't flee under fire. They kept coming, and coming, and coming. Aboard USS St. Lo, Oerlikon gunner Harold Ramsey remembered shouting to his loader, "He's not pulling up! He's not pulling up!" The Oerlikon's tracers ripped through the plane. Holes appeared in the wings. The cowling burst into flame. The propeller warped. The pilot slumped. And still the plane kept coming. Ramsey fired until his drum ran empty, and the moment he slammed in a fresh one, the kamikaze slammed into the flight deck. The explosion tore the carrier apart. Ramsey was blown clear into the air and survived only by miracle. Later, dazed and covered in oil, he whispered, "He should have been dead, but he flew until he hit us anyway." The race against the last 7 seconds. Kamikaze attacks quickly taught sailors one cruel truth. The last 7 seconds were the most important seconds of their lives. A typical attack looked like this. 5-inch guns opened fire at 5,000 yards. 40mm Bofors tore holes at 2,000 yards. Oerlikons waited until the plane closed to 800, then 600, then 400. By the final 5 seconds, when the kamikaze filled their entire field of vision, the big guns were useless. Their elevation was too slow, their shells too large, their fuses too long. Only the Oerlikon could still turn fast enough, aim fast enough, and fire fast enough to stop the incoming death machine. And so the entire burden of survival fell onto the shoulders of a handful of young men gripping vibrating steel handles, their faces inches from open sky. Sailors said it felt like standing naked before a thunderstorm made of fire. A gunner from USS Kitkin Bay recalled, "He came in so close I could see the stitching on his flight gloves. I don't remember aiming, I only remember firing and praying." Fire against flesh and steel. Kamikazes didn't behave like normal planes. They didn't flinch when hit. They didn't break off an attack. They didn't care if they were burning. They only wanted to hit. Anywhere. Any part of the ship. The Oerlikon crews learned quickly that killing the pilot wasn't enough. They had to shred the aircraft, tear off wings, smash controls, detonate fuel, break the structure apart before it reached the hull. And so the Oerlikon became not just a close defense gun, but a butcher, a saw, a last-second executioner. Gunners described moments when their tracers walked across an incoming Zero's canopy, shattering it, then chewing through the fuselage and finally ripping an entire wing off. What followed was always the same: a flaming spiral into the ocean, the steam hissing as the wreck disappeared beneath the waves. One gunner said, "When we stopped them, they didn't crash, they exploded." The deck was hell. Noise, heat, smoke, fear. During a kamikaze wave, a ship wasn't a ship anymore. It was a furnace. Engines roared, guns hammered, men screamed orders. Heat from burning planes rolled across the deck in suffocating waves. The Oerlikon gunners stood in the open, exposed to everything: burning gasoline, flying debris, shrapnel, the concussive blast of bombs, the physical shock of near misses. Yet they never stopped firing. Their arms shook, their eyes stung with sweat, shell casings piled around their feet so hot they burned through boots, and still they fired, until the kamikazes were gone. One sailor on USS Omani Bay said he fired until his right hand locked in place and medics had to pry his fingers off the grips. Another said, "Your world shrinks to the tip of your gun. There is nothing else. Not the ocean, not the ship, not the future. Only the plane coming at you." Ships saved at the very last inch. History records countless moments when the Oerlikon saved a ship by fractions of a second. USS White Plains avoided destruction when a kamikaze lost its wing under a 20mm burst and skipped off the ocean like a stone instead of smashing into the hull. USS Swanee survived a direct kamikaze wave because 3 Oerlikons fired in perfect unison, turning a suicide plane into fragments that rained harmlessly across the deck. USS Stanley, a destroyer escort, shot down an oncoming kamikaze so close that pieces of the aircraft smashed into the gun shield, but the ship lived. Over and over, reports ended with "hit destroyed at close range by 20mm fire," "impact prevented, wing severed by Oerlikon," "pilot incapacitated seconds before strike." The little gun saved hundreds, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of American sailors. The psychological war. The kamikaze strategy wasn't just physical, it was psychological torment. But the Oerlikon, that small gun with its blazing tracers and vicious bark, gave the sailors something priceless: a sense of control. It was the weapon that said, "You are not helpless. You can fight back. You can survive." Many sailors described their Oerlikon as a companion, a partner, a lifeline. In debriefings, dozens repeated the same phrase: "When the kamikazes came, we trusted the 20mm more than anything." The Oerlikon becomes a legend. By 1945, one truth had become undeniable: the Oerlikon was the weapon of the last moment. When everything else had failed, when the ship was damaged, when the sky burned, when the pilot locked onto the deck and death came screaming at 400 knots, the Oerlikon gunner still stood his post, still fired, still believed. He had to. Everyone's life depended on those last 3 seconds. When the war finally began to tilt irreversibly in America's favor in 1945, the great battleships and carriers were celebrated in headlines. Admirals were decorated. Pilots were praised as heroes. Strategists were immortalized. But if you ask the men who stood on steel decks in the firestorms of Leyte Gulf, Okinawa, or the Philippine Sea, they would tell you that the Pacific had another kind of hero, one without rank, without ceremony, without glamour. A squat little gun with a slim barrel and a drum magazine. A weapon that demanded nothing but everything. A weapon sailors trusted more than anything else in the world. The Oerlikon 20mm was not built to become legend, but it did. And its legacy, written in the memories of thousands who survived because of it, became one of the most powerful stories of the Pacific War. After the firestorms, silence on the decks. When the kamikaze waves finally slowed in early 1945, the decks of American ships were quiet for the first time in months. Smoke drifted off into the dusk. Men swept burning fragments of enemy planes into the sea. The Oerlikon mounts stood like exhausted sentinels, barrels scorched, paint blistered, breech assemblies blackened by oil and soot. Many gunners, still shaking from combat, found themselves touching the cooling metal of their guns. Not reverently, not dramatically, but with a silent, instinctive acknowledgement. One sailor on USS Bismarck Sea, a carrier later lost to a kamikaze strike, wrote in his journal, "I know it's just steel, but it felt alive when I needed it to be." Others wrote letters home describing the gun the way another man might describe a friend who pulled him from a burning car. The Oerlikon wasn't beautiful, it wasn't impressive, but it stayed, when every second felt like borrowed time. The gun that never quit. Sailors respected one thing above all else: reliability. A ship could survive damage, men could adapt, but a gun that jammed at the wrong moment could doom everyone. The Oerlikon rarely jammed, even caked in salt, even when its oil froze at night, even when its recoil springs shuddered from overuse, even when the deck pitched and rolled. It fired. It fired when the ship was burning. It fired when the sky was falling. It fired when the kamikazes came in screaming, turning the ocean itself into a mirror of fire. As one gunner put it, "That gun fired until I couldn't, and when I could again, it fired with me." The human cost and why the Oerlikon mattered so much. Close-range air defense came with a terrible price. Gunners stood fully exposed with almost no protection. Shrapnel from bursting planes tore through uniforms. Burning fuel splashed across decks. Debris smashed against steel shields. Many gunners died at their posts, hands still wrapped around the grips of their Oerlikons. On USS Hornet, A kamikaze tore across the bow, killing 3 gunners instantly. The Oerlikon mount itself was ripped in half, yet across the ship other gunners kept firing at more incoming planes, desperate to avoid another hit. Their courage became inseparable from the gun they manned. The Oerlikon didn't make them brave, but it gave them a fighting chance. A chance they seized even when death soared towards them at 300 knots. In after-action reports, officers often listed 20mm fire as the reason a ship survived an attack. But what they meant was, a man with a 20mm saved us. The fleets that lived because of it. The Oerlikon saved ships you don't read about in history books. Small ships, support ships, fueling ships, hospital ships, cargo craft filled with beans, bandages, and bullets. Without them, the Navy couldn't fight, and without the Oerlikons defending them, they wouldn't have survived the suicide wave tactics that defined late-war Japanese strategy. USS Kitkun Bay, Swanee, White Plains, Stanley, Santa Fe, Denver, Kalinin Bay all lived through attacks that should have sunk them. The difference between survival and annihilation often came down to the last 6 seconds and a few Oerlikon guns firing with everything they had left. When the war ended, a final look back. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, sailors aboard surviving ships walked the decks that had once been battlegrounds of smoke and steel. The Oerlikons were quiet now, no drums loaded, no barrels glowing, no gunners scanning the sky. But many sailors felt a strange emptiness passing by them. Some touched the guns. Some stood silently, remembering the friends who had fired beside them. Some refused to speak about the attacks at all. One veteran later said, "When I walked past my gun for the last time, I swear I heard it firing. Just echoes, just ghosts." Legacy beyond the Pacific. After the war, the Oerlikon didn't disappear. It became one of the most copied, modified, and beloved light AA guns in the world. NATO ships used it for decades. Dozens of nations adopted it. Variants appeared on fast boats, patrol craft, even armored vehicles. Modern close-in weapon systems like the Phalanx CWIS follow the same philosophy: fast, relentless, last-second defense. The Oerlikon was the ancestor of them all. But its legacy isn't just technical, it's human. The gun that saved lives and the men who manned it. In reunions decades after the war, sailors who had once stood behind the little 20mm would gather and talk. They spoke about fear, yes, but also about trust. They trusted their ship. They trusted their captain, but above all, they trusted their gun. One old veteran put it perfectly at a 1980s reunion. The admirals won the war, the pilots won the glory, but the Oerlikon kept us alive long enough to see victory. Dozens murmured in agreement. Some wiped their eyes. Some simply nodded. Final image. The Silent Guardian. Today, on museum ships across the United States, you can still see the Oerlikon. It sits quietly on the deck. The ocean laps calmly against the hull. The sky is peaceful. No kamikazes, no bombers, no smoke. But if you stop, if you place your hand on the cool steel, you feel something. A quiet weight. A whisper of memory. Because once in a sea of fire and fear, this little gun roared against the sky. And because of it, ships lived, fleets survived, men came home. The Oerlikon 20mm, the little gun that saved their lives, earned a legacy far larger than its size.